From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rob Kasunic. I'm Associate Register of Copyrights and Director of Registration Policy and Practices. And before we begin, this is a session on public and private registries. I want to go around and have everyone introduce themselves around the table, and I guess we'll begin over to my left.
Push this?
Push.
Stays on.
Just push it once. Okay.
Push, oh, there we go. All right. My name is Colin Rushing. I'm the General Counsel of Sound Exchange.
Doug Hill, I'm Managing Partner of Rights Assist, Copyright Clearance Company.
I'm Eric Harbeson from the Society of American Archivists.
I'm Patrick McCormick with International Documentary Association and Film Independent.
I'm Nancy Prager with Prager Law.
Nancy Wolff with PACA, Digital Media Licensing Association.
Eugene Mopsik, Executive Director, ASMP, the American Society of Media Photographers.
Jeff Sedlik, President and CEO of the Plus Coalition.
Megan Gray, former attorney for visual artists.
Alex McGehee, Association of Recorded Sound Collections.
Matt Shears, Computer and Communications Industry Association.
And I'm Fred Schroeder, First Vice President, National Federation of the Blind.
I'm Brad Holland, American Society of Illustrators Partnership.
Okay, well, welcome everyone, and it's nice to see some of you again. As some of you may recall, I'm a veteran from the original Orphan Works roundtables back in 2005, so interesting that we're still at this. So I guess I'd like to start by sort of giving a little summary of what I'd like to look at in this session, in addition focusing a little more from what was in the Federal Register notice. I think one thing we saw from the original Orphan Works report is that there are at least one or two things that everyone can agree on, and one is that an Orphan Works problem exists, another is that the problem is pervasive. The focus of this panel will be to discuss how registries, first starting with public and then private, can ameliorate the Orphan Works problem. We'll discuss private registries in the second half of our discussion, including ways that private registries may supplement or be integrated with or interoperate with public registries. First, I'd like panelists to focus on what can be done to modify or enhance the current U.S. Copyright Office registration and recordation systems to reduce the Orphan Works problem. The office is already aware of certain improvements that either can be made under existing statutory authority, such as the provision of a relatively simple, low-cost option to update address and rights and permissions information in existing registration records, and also expanding offerings and incentivize the provision of unique identifiers for authors and particular works for newly registered works and possibly for pre-existing records as well. Other changes that the office has recommended considering include additional incentives or requirements to register transfers of ownership in works or divisible exclusive rights in order to provide the United States Copyright Office registry with adequate chain of title information that is built into many other property registries, such as real property and motor vehicles. This may require statutory change, but burden-compliant incentives or requirements do appear to be possible. Moreover, after the initial Orphan Works report, the office considered establishing an intent-to-use registry, allowing or requiring users to register their intended use of works prior to use. Should this continue to be considered? So again, let's first focus on what can be done to modify or enhance the current Copyright Office registration and recordation systems to reduce the orphan works problems. And please keep your comments concise and on point. We don't have a lot of time, and we have a lot of participants. And if you give me some indication, I'll note your name, and we'll call on you in order. Eugene.
Yeah, happy to jump in. So there are a number of things that I think could be done from a photo standpoint, photography standpoint, to make things more efficient. The current registration practice, in particular the group registration, while particularly convenient for photographers who in fact register more works, or I believe certainly create more registerable works than any other class of rights holders, ends up with a registration that's fairly meaningless from a search or enforcement standpoint because there's no searchability. You can't identify if you submit a registration with 700 images on it in thumbnail and it's not searchable, the value from a orphan work standpoint or for identification purposes is minimal. So I think that ultimately that practice is going to be needed to change or modified so that images are registered with appropriate metadata and are ultimately searchable. I think the other thing that we've been speaking to you about and other folks in the office for years is a creation of an API that would allow photographers to register works from within their digital asset management workflow. So when they ingest a job, they process X number of images. There would be an action within that digital asset management program that would then allow them to register those images and simultaneously deposit them into a Orphan Works registry, because they'd have all the information that they would need at that point. I would imagine the information that you would need for registry would certainly serve to identify from an Orphan Works standpoint. And then, again, anything that the office or anyone else can do to create persistent actionable identifiers that would stay with photos would be fabulous. And that's why we've been working with Plus Coalition, who I think has been working closely with the Copyright Office in this regard. But if there are ways to integrate the Plus data or Plus information fields into registrations, that would go a long way to helping to identify photographs.
Thanks. Go ahead.
I just agree with
Please.
Nancy Wolff, PACA, that there are ways to make things easier on a going forward basis, and having an API in some way that's easy to register without necessarily having to use the process that's in place with the Copyright Office. I mean, I understand that there is a review that must be done to make sure the works are subject to copyright, and I know that, you know, that still needs to take place. But trying to work it in with current software would be great. I have so many people coming to our office, and you don't really want to have lawyers trying to do registrations, but I can't tell you how many complications, particularly with older works. It's so difficult to register older works. And people, you know, inherit their fathers' or mothers' works, and they want to protect them, and trying to figure out when something's published, not published. There's lots of hurdles, and maybe that leads me into the next issue. I mean, I would hesitate trying to make copyright registration as technical and as, you know, binding as real estate chain of title. I would hate to have formalities that make it even more difficult to claim ownership, and just keep that in mind. I think that, you know, real estate and authorship in some ways are two different things. Chain of title is great and helpful in the orphan word situation, but it should be something voluntary, I think, and not something that would deprive someone of their registration.
Nancy.
Nancy Prager, Prager Law. So I hate to disagree with Ms. Wolff, but I actually think having a process for assignments and everything, Rob, you said, Mr. Kasunic, you said, I completely 100% agree with. I was prepared today to air dirt, sort of say the negatives, but you want positives, so it's switching focus. I think moving forward, if we could build a database that could provide for links to works within the Copyright Office or even to external, so that you can see which work is being claimed. In the music industry, there is a long history in the 1950s and 60s, 70s probably too, of an artist recording the same song with slightly different titles for a variety of reasons, to make more money, also to get out of contracts that maybe were bad for them. And so you go on the Copyright Office database and you're not really sure which work you're looking at. Similar to over in the trademark world where you have to file specimens. So you have to, and also a drawing, so you see it two different ways. I think that would be fantastic. But I do think having a way of building into it a chain of title would allow for avoidance of orphan work problems where the works are actually still being utilized, but the copyright records are not up to date. And my concern and what I was prepared to talk about was how the copyright database wasn't up to date. And if you do a search on it and you don't see any assignment information, well, you're done under a diligent search, perhaps, if we went, sort of with a very lax system, where if you took it one step further and you went to Plus or you went to ASCAP or you went to something else, and you could find that there's a new owner in place. So the copyright database should have an incentive to record everything. Thank you.
Megan?
So to follow up on that, I think the first step that the Copyright Office could take is just retention of the deposits. So it is, so far, hasn't been practical for those deposits to be collected and digitized and made easily accessible. But at some point, maybe it can. And I think we're all anticipating that it will within our lifetime. And I think the first step in making sure that can become a reality is making sure that the deposits that we have on file now are not destroyed in the routine course of making space. I think the next thing is for the deposits that we do have, and I'm sure everybody here already is aware of this, but those deposits are public records, right? There's no question that of confidentiality or otherwise. So the public has a right to see those deposit materials. But it currently is inaccessible for the public as a practical matter because they have to physically come to the Copyright Office to get those records, assuming that the deposits are still on file. So for some deposits, it would be relatively easy to get them online because they're submitted digitally. And so I don't know why that hasn't, more progress hasn't been made in that direction. Going backwards and being retroactive with the deposits, of course, is going to be a much bigger hurdle. But given the e-filing incentives that we have now, if they're being submitted digitally already, they ought to be viewable just like the main copyright registration record is. So that's, I think those ideas could be implemented, if not outsourced. Some components of those can be implemented now.
Roy?
Roy Kaufman, Copyright Clearance Center. In keeping with Gene's API theme, you can have an API in for registration. It would also be very useful to have an API out so that the information that's in the registration can be brought out by those of us who would probably make use of it to find, more commercial and make it more searchable. More commercial uses. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. The other thing is I love the idea of author identifiers, individual author identifiers, and there are plenty of existing author identifiers in academic publishing. There's something called an ORCID. Maybe if you had a field where people could put in optionally their identifier and state which identifier they wanted to use, so that the ORCID identifier, which would be used for academic publishers, would be one thing. Maybe in music there'd be a different identifier. I don't think it's particularly useful to try to come up with a whole new identifier scheme, but there are these schemes out there that are quite helpful and they are persistent. So.
And I should just add with that there are certain kinds of unique identifiers that the office does request. It's an optional field, for instance, the ISSN or the ISRC for sound recordings. So those are existing fields that we find are largely very underutilized, and that's something we'd like to hear more about, is how we might be able to get people to participate and provide, either for works or for authors, those identifiers. Michael?
Yeah, I would say that the single most helpful thing that the Copyright Office could do regarding preventing things from becoming orphaned is to digitize all of its records, especially the records from 1923 to 1963, where it's not clear whether something was renewed or not. It would be great if a renewal could be linked to its original registration, so that there was no confusion about whether things were registered and/or renewed. And as you know, Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America has been advocating that the Copyright Office produce its own author registry. Actually, we spoke about that in 2005. Technology has come forward a little bit. The internet is certainly more pervasive than it was back then. We feel that it would not be an onerous job to provide a place whereby authors could register their copyrights separate from the actual registration process, just to put in their name, put in their contact information, and then put in some information about their works. If there was an author identifier number and a DOI for each individual work, or some sort of a numerical way of distinguishing works and disambiguating authors, it would be very, very helpful. Right now, the international community is doing some of this. I've just recently discovered something called ISNI, the International Standard Naming Institute or something. I'm sorry. But they are assigning authors numbers. They are pulling in data from the Library of Congress authorities. They're pulling in data from the VIAF and trying to consolidate all this material. And the best part about it from an author point of view is they have a procedure whereby the author can change and modify and fix the incorrect information that they might have for them.
And Michael, as to your first point, just to clarify that the office has been digitizing all of the old records, and we have digitized all of the catalog of copyright entries that existed, and have pretty much all of the, or millions of the file cards digitally scanned. And so at some point, hopefully when funding is available, to make those, figure out a way to present those so that you can find that information, that we're actively hoping to get those up in the very near future.
But none of that digitization is for the deposit material, for the actual copyright
It's not for the deposits, right?
And my only thing I would say is that my impression was that you haven't put the emphasis on the 1923 to 1963 material as much as I think is justified.
I believe we have scanned all that, but we can look into that further after. Matt?
So I encouraged to hear some of the things that when the PTO did the green paper panels, some of these issues were addressed in the online licensing, and there I commented about the need for an outward-facing API, and it may have been in our comments. I don't recall. But the fact is for precisely the same cost factors that you want an inward-facing API. In other words, the ability, an API that facilitates the office's ability to take information in. You want to have one that facilitates people taking information out, and I think the Copyright Clearance Center comments indicated that. And one of the reasons why that's so important is that increasingly so many of the services we're talking about are are working with very large portfolios of works, and so trying to do a work-by-work search for any service of relevance, just the transaction costs are going to swamp the potential benefits. And additionally, you're going to run into the kinds of problems that were being discussed with photography, where different classes of works have different characteristics, and so metadata about what's in the image is going to matter a lot more in photographs, for example, than other classes. And so if you have the ability for services to sort of take information out on a regularized basis, different constituencies will have the ability to map their own data on top of that, right, that'll be relevant for their markets or their user base, and facilitate new works as they come along. And so then the Copyright Office isn't in the business of always having to sort of keep up with all the technological change. And that means, that all databases in the universe are not going to be the same. Some will have a lot of information that others don't, but they will be sort of customized for the constituency that needs them. And that might actually take a lot of the burden off the Copyright Office to sort of keep adding its own voluntary identifiers. But none of that's going to happen if you don't have a standardized way of allowing people to take that base information out and work with it.
Thanks. Eric? So I'm kind of seeing a couple of different kinds of materials that folks are talking about here. You have the works where, like Ms. Gray over here was talking about, where you have the Copyright Office has received registration, but the information from that registration may not be available to the public. There's other material where the records were once current, they were registered, they were once current, but they're not now. Those things, I think, we can largely get at with existing data, with modifications to existing databases, and not to tell you folks how to do your job, but I would point out that there are a lot of people in this very building who are doing a lot of work creating unique identifiers in the authorities .lsc.gov, and I think that's a really first-rate database. And that's kind of where I'd like to go with the concern of archivists, because what we're looking at is material that was not only never, that's not just, it's not outdated, we don't have outdated information or inaccessible information, but we don't have any information at all. This is a lot of what folks have been talking about so far are published works where there was commercial intent or possible commercial intent, whereas archivists are worried about what is, I think it's probably safe to say, the vast majority of orphan works, which are things like my notes, which I'm writing down right now, which I have a copyright on, but which no one will ever be able to trace, and which could one day end up in my personal archives somewhere if they are deemed that important. So, so I think that any talk about a registry solution for the orphan works problem really needs to consider these materials that no one has ever heard of very carefully, and that would require something like, I don't know how it would be done, but it almost has to be a voluntary opt-in registry. I'm not thinking of another way to go about that. The thing that is most important to us from a registry point of view is that there be one registry.
Just to follow up, an opt-in registry from the notice of use standpoint to say that you're about to use the orphan work, or from the actual, I guess, orphan owner, which would be, I suppose, somewhat theoretically difficult. So I just wanted to get a little bit more detail on that.
I mean, I guess when I said that I probably was just speaking off the top of my head and not necessarily for SAA, but I think that I'm trying to think of a way that you could have a registry of John Smiths who may have taken sent a letter to an important person, and if you if you don't even know to, I think that that those kind of semi-anonymous people out there that are contributing these orphan works to our cultural heritage would kind of need to make themselves known somehow and then provide contact information, because a notice of intent to, maybe an intent to use, a notice of intent to use would require that you know what the work is that might be being used, right? And I'm sure that I've sent letters to people that I've completely forgotten about. So, thank you.
Gene?
A couple of quick points. One, in regard to comment that was just made about the need to have a single registry, I don't think that's going to happen, but I think what's important is that registries are federated, that they can talk to each other. And if that happens, you end up accomplishing the same goal. Beyond that, I think for photographs, the issue is not, I guess, the ability to attach a discrete identifier. The issue is making that persistent, something that sticks with the, either sticks with the photo or sticks in a database that can then identify that rights holder or a photo in a manner, again, that PLUS uses. And then one comment again about the activities in the EU. Last year, Jeff and I traveled on a number of occasions to the UK and EU and worked with people who are working on something called the RDI project, the Rights Data Integration Project, and the Linked Content Coalition. And they have available, I think they were just awarded, is it the equivalent of $1.5 million? Close to $1.5 million to do a test project, this RDI project, where they'll be linking various databases together for the purposes of image identification and to be able to monetize those. Oh, and again, my point is that they have EU support for that, and it's something that we don't get that. I mean, you don't get that kind of budget to be able to front those kinds of projects here on a test basis, unfortunately.
Jeff?
First, the acronym API is being thrown around. It's Application Programming Interface, and all it means is allow one system to talk to another system. It's a specification and a way for these two systems or multiple systems to talk to each other. And I really think that that's the direction that the Copyright Office should go, is bringing stakeholders together and discussing a means to allow your system to communicate with other systems, and then relying on private industry and others to develop interfaces and systems for search and for registration, where you hold the data that you need to hold, but provide in and out access. I'm echoing everybody else's comments here. Much in the same way that the Copyright Office came to industry and suggested that we form this coalition that's now called the PLUS Coalition, which has many of the people seated on this panel and in other panels, from the libraries to the museums to the photographers and illustrators and advertising agencies, et cetera, just working on the solution of identifying works and creating a global registry hub. That word hub is important. I agree with Gene that a single registry will not fly. We're looking at a global issue here. A United States registry or a United States identification systems is not the answer. We need to work internationally on adopting an identification system and on linking multiple registries, both public and private, together, so that you can both submit images and search, and that a search of any one registry will search all registries.
Well, and before I get to you, Nancy, I just wanted to open this up, since we're in the second half hour, is just that we should, let's specifically also include some discussion of how private registries and ways that they can play a role in diminishing the existence or the orphan works problem. So, and particularly, what role can private registries play to supplement public registries? And I think we've heard a lot about how those APIs can facilitate that kind of interaction, but would like to hear more. Should private registries be linked in some way to the U.S. Copyright Office registry through APIs or otherwise? And what role should the office play in certifying such third-party registries? Nancy?
All right, thank you. I was very honored to be asked to be on this panel because I do a lot of work with the private registries in the music side, and they may have some of the oldest private registries available. I would tread very carefully in doing anything that might put the imprint of the federal government giving any classification that the data in those databases is good. It is disheartening how difficult it is when you're operating in that system and you find information that not only is incorrect, but also potentially fraud. An example I'll give, Colin Rushing is here, and I'm just going to put it on the table. Sound Exchange database called Plays is littered with people who have filed as the rights holders for sound recordings, for which there is no chance they own them. They're European compilation labels that are claiming royalties on behalf of the labels that are orphans, the ones that I mentioned in the last, labels that have been lost over time through acquisition or just bankruptcies or just people give up on their labels. You can find works not available in the United States, readily available in Europe, because these labels know that rights holders have no opportunity, or artists have no real chance of going over there to claim their rights unless they're the top 1% of music performers that make up 75% of sales. So I would tread very, and it's not just Sound Exchange Plays, ASCAP, BMI, CSAC as well, Harry Fox too. Information can be missing. It can also, clerical errors, like we have an issue this year where a publisher who now operates under the name of a publisher that was around in the 60s is getting the performance royalties from the PRO on behalf of a songwriter who claims she never signed a contract with that original publisher anyway, so therefore why were they getting that money? The PRO's response to her was, prove to us you don't have a contract, or go get us something from the second one that says that they don't have the rights. So in an industry that's had a long history with these private registries, I can point, and I'm happy to sit down and go through data after data with you of these mistakes. Additionally, there's a problem between the PROs that they will not play nice with each other. Unlike in Europe, where there's only one PRO for each country, and often only one for each right, so they do both the neighboring rights and the musical composition rights. We have multiple players in the marketplace that are trying to protect their revenue streams. There's some private players in the music industry that have very valuable databases that they're not making available, even if someone offers to pay for it, that they've collected all the data that people would need. So we need a way of getting this information out of these walled gardens into a more public, and that's going to take the Copyright Office, but I think you're going to have to start from scratch.
Okay, we'll go to
Sorry, I didn't mean to talk so much.
Patrick and Jeff, but I wanted to just add that these are some things that we have been concerned about, at least in terms of the issue one, the issue of fraud, and for updating information. In the registries, there is some concern about whether people could put in false information and redirect all of the revenues to some different source, and how do we deal with that? Also, the issue of the value of distinguishing between the Copyright Office record, and if there is linkage between the Copyright Office and private registries, how do we distinguish those differences? There can be add-ons that might be at least informationally useful that private registries can provide, but where the accuracy or verification of that information, the government can't put that relationship too far. So Patrick?
We agree that there shouldn't be a government fingerprint or endorsement of any of these private registries. Where we differ, however, is that if this reform were to pass, then with the huge influx of registries and the need for easy searchability with metadata and the massive amount of different kinds of media, that a single registry won't suffice, and that private registries are more nimble and better suited to adapt to new technological advances. The Copyright Office should function as a clearinghouse for these registries and provide links to these and point them out to users who might want them, but not necessarily endorse them, just allow people to find registries that are established and that people are using. And I'd like to speak to some comments that were made earlier about the intent to use registry. Those registries seem to function well as an idea for archival houses or libraries or that kind of thing where that may be part of their diligent search in finding the rights holder. But for individual users of different kinds of media, such as documentary filmmakers or journalists, that can raise serious confidentiality issues with projects if they have to announce what media they intend to use. It can cause a huge problem with the timing of production if certain media has to wait for a mandatory waiting period in a registry like that before they can use it. Other users will find it misleading if they see that there and fail to do their own diligent search, which is a further concern because they may be the best situated party to actually find the rights holder. And after having performed a truly diligent search, however we define it, if you still haven't found the rights holder, that's not a likely party to show up and be monitoring a registry like this. You're more likely to have trolls registering for this, looking for easy settlements, establishing themselves as the rights holder, threatening injunctions, or however else it may be, and really driving up the costs of productions for things like this.
Okay, well, Jeff, Nancy, and then Brad. Okay.
In any system, any registry system, or any system at all, there's going to be good actors and there's going to be bad actors, and there is little that you can do to absolutely prevent bad actors. I would agree that the Copyright Office should not be in a position of running a global registry network. First of all, the Copyright Office is part of the Library of Congress and part of the U.S. government, and again, we're looking at a global issue. Second of all, the Copyright Office is not really charged with verifying the accuracy of the information submitted to the Copyright Office on registrations currently. I could submit all the photographs ever taken by every person in this room, and as long as I fill out the copyright registration application correctly, it's likely that I will get a certificate that I am the copyright owner of all of your photographs. However, it doesn't mean I'm the copyright owner of all of your photographs. The paper's worth nothing. This is what the courts are for. You have bad actors, you make their actions either illegal or you kick them out of the system. The way that we're addressing it within the PLUS registry is we are not going to make determinations as to who owns what. We're going to allow the users to place records into dispute with public notification, and then people can come to us with a court order from whatever country they're from, and we will pull things down or edit them or remove them based on court order. The other thing I wanted to address was earlier there was a suggestion about making all the deposits public. I want to make sure that everyone understands that visual artists and other creators often register works that are not intended to be public at that time. It might be a photograph that's going to go on a book cover, photographs of a car or automobile that's not yet out there released, confidential type information that is submitted, and currently the only way that you can get at those deposits is to either go to the Copyright Office and look at it on a computer sitting there in that system, or you can be either an attorney representing a litigant or the owner, and you can get access to that deposit information. But I think if we did make all the deposits public, we would have to have a means for masking the work back when it needs to be confidential, similar to, I believe that there's another provision for another type of work that might be architectural plans or something to mask it back so that you can't actually see the deposits themselves. That was it.
Nancy?
I guess going back to the question, sorry, of the role of private registries, and I think they will play an important part because there is no one size fits all. For example, I think even if you look at many of the images that are available commercially, if you want to do a search of many of the large databases, you can find things. In fact, PACA has something since we talked about this in 2005, Orphan Search. Actually, if you're trying to find an image, you can contact the director and he'll send out a request to every single member within it, and they'll look in their database the digital images. So there are many private databases that are very helpful. And again, yes, there always will be, anyone can upload a picture and say they took it. I mean, I recently was involved in a case with 2 Woodstock photographers, and they both registered the same photographs here. And we had this messy federal court case about it. One thing that might be helpful with registries, if maybe there was a process that perhaps the Library Copyright Office could deal with, just an easy sort of dispute resolution. So anytime there could be an author issue that maybe wasn't, you had to register, go to federal court, have something similar, more like a domain name dispute. Make some of those things would be helpful for keeping registries reliable. I know I sat 3 years on the 108 committee, and we talked a lot about having trusted depositories for preservation, because you don't want everyone to be, making databases of other people's works. And I think probably the sort of the best use of the Copyright Office is working with the different stakeholders in having best practices and directing people to the most reliable registries.
Brad?
Visual artists have, I think, 2 major problems with registries, whether they're commercial or private. The first is the extent to which work not registered in the registries would come to be considered either in statute law or by practice as an orphan. In other words, if you can't find it in one of the registries, does it become an automatic orphan? The second one is that the experience of artists with things like stockhouses is that a lot of photographers and a lot of artists entrusted their work to some of these stock agencies and found that the agencies were not only breaching their contracts and infringing their work, dumping their work, their managed copyrights into the royalty-free market, and then using the work they were entrusted with to go steal clients from the very artists who had entrusted them with the work. If companies like that become registries, and we know that some of them have been lobbying on behalf of the Orphan Works Bill, we don't know what they've been lobbying for because they've asserted attorney-client privilege. But we've got documentation from artists that their rights have been abused, their copyrights have been infringed, their contracts have been breached, and they have begun putting out work, not only taking in high commissions, anywhere between 50% to 90% in some cases. They've been removing artists' names from the work. There's even one case in Illustration of an artist whose last name began with a C and who used his signature to encase a copyright symbol. So what did the Stockhouse do? They cut the C off of his name so that the copyright symbol was removed, and then dumped his work on the royalty-free market. He could sue, of course, but the agency is owned by the richest man in the world, and who wants to go into court with a situation like that? In this SBA roundtable, there were a number of photographers who gave estimates of what it would cost them to comply with this registration. I won't read their comments, but I'll read some of the figures. One photographer estimated that it would cost him between $104,000 and $263,000 to comply with a law that required him to register work. Another suggested $25 to $50 per image. One suggested, based on information from Corbis, $70 per image. One photographer estimated $80,000 to, $80,000 in 2 years. If he hired someone at minimum wage to do nothing else for 2 years, it would cost him $80,000. Another one estimated 50 to 750,000. I won't go on. I've spent the last 5 years digitizing a lot of my old work, and I will estimate that for me to comply with an orphan works law would cost me $250,000 and would take either 5 years if I could afford to hire somebody full-time at $10 an hour, 40 hours a week, or take me 10 years if I could only afford to hire them at $10 an hour for 20 hours a week. That's $250,000 and anywhere from 5 years to 10 years, and that would not include metadata, because there'd be no way I could go back 25, 30, 40, 50 years and dig up metadata to include in this, not to mention filling out forms. I'm 70 years old. My creative life would be over if this kind of law were passed. So that's the first problem that not only artists, but we have a statement in here from Jerry Colby, who in 2008 was the president of the National Writers Union, making the same claim about writers, that it would simply be impossible for them to register all the work they would need in a registry of this sort. The other thing, I won't go on, but there was a comment made earlier about digital object identifiers and author identifiers of the sort. We, in the Illustrators Partnership, which was the parent organization to this group that we represent now is actually 12 organizations. It's a coalition of everything: medical illustrators, cartoonists, general science illustrators, aviation artists, and regional artist groups from various cities. And our parent organization, the Illustrators Partnership, which we started in 2000, in 2003 made an approach to the Copyright Clearance Center, specifically to Joe Allen, who at that time was CEO, asking how artists could be represented as authors in the work that CCC was licensing. And we were told CCC had no way of licensing art, that they would talk with us if we would come back to them with a proposal for how we could track the usage of the work. So we contacted a company called Identity Commons in Accordance, and at a great deal of expense, and over a period of a year, we came up with a proposal which we drafted with the help of technical experts from Identity Commons in Accordance, and we presented it to Joe Allen, who told us, well, he couldn't talk about this, but he'd give us the name of his director of author relations. We had a conference call that he said he could only spend half an hour with us, then ask us what our favorite color was, what kind of music we liked. We couldn't get down to the business of talking about persistent identity tags. We had artists ready to embed these tags in their work that would go through the Copyright Clearance Center, but we could not get anyone from CCC to talk with us. When Joe Allen retired, we tried to talk with the new director, Tracy Armstrong. We arranged a meeting at which nothing was concluded. We also know that the Artists' Rights Society, which handles the estates of Picasso, Matisse, Jackson Pollock, Frank Lloyd Wright, and 40,000 fine artists, has also been trying to work with CCC to find some way that work can be tracked. Now, we made in 2005 a proposal to the Copyright Office that CCC be encouraged to work with illustrators and graphic artists and fine artists to find a way to embed these kind of persistent identity tags with our work and then use it to track the work so that artists could be paid. Nothing ever came of our proposal. It could be done with money that is actually being returned overseas right now from reprographic licensing that is not being directed to CCC, but is going to a number of organizations who, in the case of graphic arts, have refused to account for what they have done with the money. This money could be
I hate to cut you off, but I know that we have a lot of other people.
I know. Let me just finish, then I won't say anything else.
No, you can say more, but I just want to make sure that I think there were a number of hands that were up.
I will, but this is a concrete proposal that would not cost anybody any money. It could be done with money that is already being licensed in the commercial usage of illustrators' work.
Okay, we're going to go to Eric, Doug, and then Colin.
So the question is still the private registries, I think, right? And so I wanted to, first, if I could clarify my statement, when I said that what we need is one registry, what we need is one place to look. If it's a federated system of registries, that is functionally the same thing. I think, as has been pointed out earlier, if you have a whole lot of private registries, you're going to increase the cost of search. Now, as I mentioned in the earlier panel, we have studies that have shown how much the cost of searching for an orphan work is, especially as you move down the line. When you have an archives that is trying to make up for 50 years of non-record keeping over the ownership of a work, it's going to cost a significant amount of money. And if we have a public good that we're trying to meet, where we're trying to make the information available according to the best practices of our profession, we need to be able to, I mean, if we are expected to do this, I think that there needs to be some way for us to be able to reliably find the work without spending more than 70% of our time on the problem. Now, I should say, the registry question is definitely, so we strongly prefer a registry solution over something like an extended collective licensing solution, which I know you're going to talk about tomorrow. But for kind of the same reason, that would, whereas a solution that doesn't involve a very easy way of searching and showing due diligence, right? So if properly done, a registry solution should be you search in this registry, and that is your due diligence. You don't have to search in 20 different registries and do a long trail, because that's how you get your 70% of your time spent on copyright work rather than on the work of the profession of the archival. So, but we strongly prefer that. Without something like that, our time is we may as well not make use of the works in the first place. With an ECL regime, we're putting money into a system where, as our research shows, the vast majority of the time, the money will never even be claimed.
Okay. Douglas? The need for the private or public registries are about access and monetization. You either need to get access to images to be able to, or audio files or any other intellectual property, be able to use it, or you're interested in being able to monetize it either as the owner or as someone who wants to use that material in a project. So there's never going to be a situation in which the Copyright Office will be able to be central to that access. It just is not possible for you to be the repository of everything that could possibly be used. Therefore, there's going to have to be registries of a variety of kinds spread across the industry. The best situation is going to be for the Copyright Office to enable an API to be able to access that information directly back and forth amongst those registries, and or pass through requests to the Copyright Office, to those registries, to be able to answer those questions. That's a way in which you're facilitating the information exchange, you're enabling people to get access to the material, and you're attempting to resolve the issue of, I cannot find this copyright holder. No one's yet talked about work we do, which is we go to the estates, we go to the probate offices in the city we think that individual may have died in, try and get a copy of their will and determine where their estate passed the rights for their materials for. If they're older than a certain age and died prior to 1970, roughly, then we know they're not going to mention anything at all about where their rights passed to, because until Elvis died, the idea of passing that right on to a future generation was not a big moneymaker. But at $85 million, that's got a lot of people's attention about how to be able to monetize it after you're gone. And it becomes for some photographers, it becomes a legacy to pass on to their children. So if the Copyright Office can figure out how to be able to enable that process of the sharing of information, I think that's the single greatest contribution you can make to the industry of intellectual property in general.
Okay, Colin, then Frederic.
Sure. So I hate to sort of dial things back a few speakers ago, but I just wanted to respond to Nancy's question, which actually is a good segue to one of the points I wanted to make. So Nancy earlier talked about the Sound Exchange database and specifically the Plays database as an example of some of the problems of private registries. And I can understand where that perception would come from. The Plays database, though, is not actually our database, and this is why I think it's an interesting sort of object lesson. The Plays database really reflects the raw material that Sound Exchange gets and is in the process of being matched. It's not intended to be a sort of public-facing registry of who owns what. It's our attempt to, basically give the public, hopefully, record companies and recording artists an opportunity to say, hey, I think this is mine. We use that as a piece of information. We actually have a really sort of complicated process to take all the information that we get and make sure we're paying the right people, which I think is a useful illustration, because the value that a private registry has is sort of part of this network of information out there is the people that Sound Exchange and other organizations like us, or the role we play is paying people for works that they own. And so the people participating in that have a really strong incentive to participate and make sure the information is accurate. And no one is perfect, and we wouldn't claim to be, but we have a process to make changes all the time. And in fact, we're regularly updating accounts through our claims department to make sure we're paying as accurately as possible. So I think that is one important takeaway, which is that there really is value in having private registries, seeing them as a source of accurate information, because the participants have an incentive, an immediate financial incentive to get the information right. The other thing that our Plays database illustrates is the sort of matching challenge. Whenever you're talking about a registry, you're talking about a record of hopefully who owns what. And in the case of most works that have commercial value, you're talking about who owns what, when, and in which territory, which can be incredibly complicated. That's just the information about who owns what, where, when, and where. There's a first step challenge of making sure that you're actually accurately matching to that. Because the license that we do is a statutory license, the people using it, they can just sort of give us, what they believe is their sort of best effort. But it's incredibly poor, and the Plays database really reflects the type of information that we're getting from the users of the recordings, not the information that we're relying on. And I think it's sort of illustrative of the challenge of, frankly, matching incoming information to information in a database.
Okay, Frederic, and then Alex, and I think we're out of time after that.
Yeah, thank you. I recognize in the time I'll be very brief. I just want to say that particularly with mass digitization of materials now, there's unprecedented access to information by blind people and others with print disabilities. And as we look at legislation, regulations that deal with access to intellectual property, just to remember that the use that is vital to blind people and others to get to this information, that it not be inadvertently compromised, made more complicated, or that disincentives to making materials available not be an unintended casualty. And I just want to say one other quick thing. With databases, some of your users of databases are blind people, and I can tell you that there are many, many databases these days that are not readily searchable using non-visual text-to-speech or other assistive technology. And it seems to me that if people are expected to do a search of a database, there needs to be the enforcement of requirements around accessibility.
Thanks. Alex?
I'd like to reinforce a couple of comments that have been made today about simplifying the system. I think it would be very helpful if people understood definition of what due diligence is, because there seem to be a lot of definitions of it, and it's a situation that can wind up in court. The second thing is, our organization is a relatively small group. We're about 1,500 archivists, librarians, sound collectors, sound enthusiasts, and someone who has got to go through the process of finding the original owner of a work is really up a tree in terms of cost, and that was mentioned earlier. So I think the system has got to be let me make it very hard for you, relatively simple. It has to be low cost, which means it doesn't involve lawyers, with my excuse to fellow members of the panelists. And it needs to take care of a unique problem that we have in recorded sound, which is pre-1972 records. They, right now, are under individual state laws, and this needs to be federalized so that pre-72 recordings can be found in one place and under one piece of legislation, and we don't get into a situation like we do with the New York law, which is the most stringent law, and so everybody now goes by the New York standard. There needs to be a federal standard. Thanks.
Yes, we have just a few moments. I think we're running a little bit over, so just a few moments to take any questions from the audience. As before, we'll have a microphone if anybody has any questions. If not, we'll end with Gene if there are no audience questions. Anybody from the audience? Okay, Gene.
Thank you. So I'm going to make a few, you'll be sorry, maybe. They're kind of extraneous comments, but I've been listening all morning about, and I've heard two things. I've heard about public good, and I've heard about how difficult it is to identify orphan works. I think, so I'm an unabashed representative and advocate for independent small creators. I know my photographers wish every day when they go out to a job that the job would be easy. But not all the jobs are easy. Some of the jobs are hard, some of them are more difficult, some of them are impossible, what I used to call subject failure. They're faced with try to make something good that's impossible, a real pig in a poke. But they have to do it. Comes with the territory. Public good at whose expense? I guess I just have a hard time understanding, how we can be expected to, provide works without any compensation in an ongoing basis and still expect to sustain a class, a creative class, and have people sustain their livelihoods. So I can go on forever on this, but I just felt compelled to make those comments having listened to, as far as I'm concerned, I guess it goes with the territory. If it's difficult to find a rights holder, well, so be it. It's difficult. It comes with your job.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.